Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the final class in the series, The Laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile Relations by Dr. Shana Strauch Schick. And without delay, I'll turn this to Dr. Strauch Schick.
Thank you so much. And welcome everyone to our final class on the laws of Kashrut and Jewish-Gentile relations. So over the past 5 weeks, we have learned about food that's cooked by a non-Jew and the laws related to that, a bread that's baked by a non-Jew. And we've seen how while the Mishnah lists these as prohibitions throughout time, the prohibition has either been mitigated in the case of a bishul akum, food cooked by a non-Jew, to include a very minimal act of participation on the part of a Jew, to a pat akum, which we most of the time many people don't observe it at all. And indeed, kashrut organizations do grant a kashrut certification to bread which is baked by a non-Jew. If I didn't mention it last time, in Paris, I know a kosher Jews eat the baguettes there anywhere, even without a hashgacha on it. And again, that would be because it's pat hakum, so it's not something which requires a kashrut certification per se. Okay, so now we are going to examine one more food, or food type, which is in that same Mishnah that which we began with, and that's the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, where we saw our original prohibition against bishul akum and pat akum. And we're going to return to that list to actually the first thing on the list, which is milk. Says in this Mishnah, Elu devrim shalavdei kochavim isurin ve'ein isuran isur hana'ah. The following things are products which belong to a non-Jew, and they are prohibited to eat, but there's no prohibition against getting a benefit from them. And the first thing on the list is halav shel chavo ovei kochavim ve'ein Yisrael ohavo. Milk which a non-Jew milked without an Israelite watching over him. And of course, on that list, we've already seen the hapat, v'hashemen shelahem, their bread and their oil, and oil was made allowed by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and we saw hashilakot, food which is cooked by a non-Jew. So we've already explored these two elements on the list, and now we are going to, for our final class, look at the laws of milk. Halav shel chavo uvei kochavim. Milk which a non-Jew milks. And hopefully, assuming we'll have time, we'll also look at other milk products such as cheese, and whether a Jew can eat a cheese that a non-Jew makes, and what kind of cheeses that would apply to, and whatnot. Okay, so since the Mishnah lists some things which are prohibited, we saw in the other cases, the Talmudic discussion is often, why is this thing made prohibited? Why did the rabbi say that a Jew cannot have milk that a non-Jew milks? I mean, it's presumably from a kosher animal, and what non-kosher product could a non-Jew add to the milk? And we've seen in the case of bread, and even the case of food, there's a fear it could lead to intermarriage. Would that apply to this as well? So the Gemara, we'll look at the Bavli, lists several reasons why milk is prohibited, and it gives a few possibilities, and then rejects them. So let's go to the next source on the page, which is, so it's the second source on the page, and I gave you the English to it as well. So ask the Gemara, halav lemai nichashlei. What is the problem with milk? What are we concerned about that a Jew cannot have the milk that a non-Jew milks? Mishum ichlufe. If the concern is that maybe the non-Jew will replace this cow's milk for another non-kosher animal milk, but that can't be because, says the Gemara, there's very a clear difference between a kosher animal milk and non-kosher animal milk. Kosher milk, says the Gemara, tahor cheyor. Pure kosher animal's milk is white. Tameh yarok, whereas non-kosher animal milk is green, apparently. So just to have this out here. So the first problem the Gemara suggests is maybe they will exchange the milk of a kosher animal with a non-kosher animal, but this is rejected because a kosher milk is white, non-kosher milk is green. So now the Gemara gives another possible reason for why the milk of a non-Jew would be prohibited. Mishum yaruve, if the concern is the non-Jew will maybe mix in some non-kosher milk. So it's a cow's milk or it's a goat's milk, but maybe they'll mix in some pig's milk. So it says the Gemara, well, if that's your concern, just let the milk curdle. And Rashi explains, Yamidenu alde akiva legeniva. Let the milk curdle in the there's a word for this, in the rennet of an animal, and then you'll see if it's a kosher milk or not. Why? Why is this a test? The Marmar for the master said, Halav tahor omed, Halav tameh ein omed. Only a kosher milk curdles, whereas non-kosher milk does not curdle. So if you're not sure if a non-Jew has put in some non-kosher milk, just test the milk. See if it curdles or not. And if it does, obviously it's a kosher milk and you can have it. If it doesn't curdle, it's obviously not a kosher milk and you won't have it. But why should we ban all non-Jewish milk? So says the Gemara, well, well, if you want to use this milk for cheese, then yeah, no problem. Then you can do this curdling test to see if it's a kosher or not. But what are we dealing with here in the Mishnah? It's where you want to use this milk for a food called kimcha, which is what's referred to as tach, which we saw last time. It's where they would mix like a bread crust with milk. So you're going to be using the milk as milk, and you don't want to turn it into a cheese. So that's why you can't do the curdling test, because you want to use the milk as milk and not turn it into a cheese. Then the Gemara says, well, nishkam mine akali v'nikum. Well, why don't you just take a little bit of the milk and see if it will curdle. And if that little bit amount of curdles, then you'll know that the rest of the milk is a kosher milk. So says the Gemara, Kevan de betahor nami ika nisyuve de lo kaime. Since there's even a kosher milk that doesn't curdle, lekala mekam ala demilta. There's no way to rely on this. You have no way to test this milk to see if it's a kosher milk or not, because there is some kind of a kosher milk that wouldn't curdle. Now Rashi explains why this would be, and we'll return to that next. So either the problem with milk is that it's where the Jew won't be turning it into a cheese, but there is whey in a kosher milk, and which has not a curdle, so there's no way to test to see if it's a kosher milk or not. So that's one reason given as to why we are not allowed to have milk produced by a non-Jew. That's the first reason the Gemara ultimately gives. So it gave two possible reasons, then we rejected them. And now it gives one other reason as to why we don't have milk of a non-Jew. The Aleph Bet Aleph means the I abides ema, and if I want, I might say, afilu tema de kabai legavina. Even if you do want to make this milk into a cheese, Iga deka bene atafe. There is milk that remains between the crevices of the curdle cheese. And for this, let's look in Rashi. So I'm gonna stop the share and share the sources in case not everyone has it. So Rashi here explains, so what's a problem with both of these? Either that there's whey in the milk which won't curdle, or there might be some cracks in the cheese where some milk remains. Rashi explains, Shana netare bo chalav tameh. Maybe there is some non-kosher animal milk mixed in. Ukishamidu omei tahor shabo. And when you curdle the cheese, when you curdle this milk into a cheese, only the kosher milk curdles. V'hatame nishar im hanisuvi. Whereas the unkosher animal milk will remain with the whey of the kosher milk, the WHEY. It'll remain with the part of the kosher milk that doesn't curdle. Halakhah ein ze nisayon lahachshir harishonim. Therefore, there's no way to test whether the milk that curdles is actually a kosher milk. But in terms of having it for cheese, this milk would be okay. We'll get back to this later. So that's why, according to the first explanation of the Gemara, we cannot have milk produced by a non-Jew, because even when a kosher milk curdles, there is still some aspects of the milk that will not curdle, and maybe the non-Jew mixed in some non-kosher animal milk, which will not curdle, along with a part of the kosher milk that also doesn't curdle. So there may be some non-kosher milk mixed in. That's the upshot of what Rashi is explaining here. And according to the second answer of the Gemara, that when the milk curdles into cheese, there's some cracks in it. Again, Rashi explains, B'toch hagumot shebigivina. There's some cracks in the cheese. V'chayshina, we are concerned, shema min hachalav tameh. Shalo omeid nishar im hanisuvi bigumot. Maybe some non-kosher milk was mixed in, and that non-kosher milk will stay hidden in the cracks of the cheese, along with the part of the kosher milk that doesn't curdle. So, going back to my other share. So, why can't we have milk produced by a non-Jew? So either, if you would have thought maybe they're using non-kosher animal milk, no, that is not a concern, because we can tell a difference between a kosher milk, which is white, and non-kosher animal milk, which is green. Okay, so that reason is rejected. Then the concern is, well, maybe they will put some non-kosher milk in with the kosher milk and won't be able to see, because it'll get mixed together. Again, the Gemara originally rejects that the cause, only kosher milk curdles. To which the Gemara says, okay, well, there's an easy solution. Why don't we just curdle the milk to see if it curdles or not, and if it does, it's kosher. If it doesn't, it's not kosher. So the Gemara says, well, it's where the Jew won't be turning the milk into a cheese. The Jew wants to drink the milk as is, or add it to a food where you need the milk in its milk form, not as cheese. So then the Gemara says, why don't you just take a little bit and test it? So ultimately it says, because there is whey, W-H-E-Y, in a kosher milk, which does not curdle. So there's no way to test milk to see if there's some non-kosher milk mixed in it or not. Or alternatively, even where the Jew will be turning the milk into cheese, there is some milk that remains between the crevices of the curdled cheese, and there's a fear that there may be some non-kosher milk mixed in there that we don't see. So ultimately, why is milk produced by a non-Jew prohibited? The answer of the Gemara is there might be milk from a non-kosher animal mixed in, and in a way that you wouldn't be able to see. Okay, so that is so that's really what comes out of this Gemara, and that is mainly the view of the Yerushalmi as well. Now, what comes out of the Mishnah, though, it says that where a Jew watches the animal being milked, then one could have the milk of a non-Jew, as long as a Jew is watching. So that is one way that the Gemara or the Mishnah allows milk of a non-Jew. So we already see, even within this prohibition, there's already, I guess, a crack in it, so to speak. If a Jew is watching, then there is no fear that some non-kosher milk will be mixed in, and therefore the milk would be kosher. Now, returning back to the sources, the Rambam talks about this halakhah as well, obviously. Now, interestingly, he doesn't mention it in his apirish to the Mishnah. In his explanation of the Mishnah, he doesn't explain the reason for the prohibition against non-Jewish milk. But in his Mishnah Torah, his codex of halakhah, the Jewish law, he explains as follows. So this is, again, in Machalot Asuro, prohibited foods, chapter Gimel. So reading in the Rambam, it says as follows. Chalav behema teme'ah eino nikva ve'omed kechalav hatehora. So non-kosher animal milk does not curdle into milk the way a kosher milk does, as we saw in the Gemara. And if some non-kosher milk is mixed into a kosher milk, and if you curdle a kosher milk, then some of the non-kosher milk will stay behind, and that will not curdle. And for this reason, says the Rambam, Yitain Hadin, Shakol Chalav Nimsa B'Yad Akum, all milk produced by a non-Jew, meaning that a non-Jew milks, Asor is prohibited, Shema Are Bo Chalav Behema Tme'ah, lest some non-kosher animal milk was mixed in, and even if it curdles, it will remain behind with the way of the kosher milk, which didn't curdle. And so the halakhah is pretty clear. We don't have milk produced by a non-Jew, and this is how the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef codifies the halakhah as well. And also his laws of machalot of de kochavim, Siman Kuf Tabav, he writes as follows. Any milk which a non-Jew milks and a Jew is not watching is prohibited. Lest he mixed in some non-kosher animal milk. If a non-Jew is milking in his own home and a Jew is sitting outside, as long as you know that there was absolutely no non-kosher animal in his herd, then it would be okay. This milk would be allowed. Even if the Jew was not watching while the non-Jew milked the cow. But if he did have a non-kosher animal among his flock, and the Jew is outside while the non-Jew is inside milking, but he is milking this cow for the purpose of the Jew. If the Jew can see while he's sitting, but if you could stand up and see the non-Jew milking the cow, then mutar, then that would be allowed. Because the non-Jew will be afraid that you're going to stand up and look. And by the way, it has to be where the non-Jew knows that a Jew is not allowed to have milk from a non-kosher animal. So the halakhah is very clear. A Jew has to either be watching the non-Jew milk the cow, or the Jew has to be there and know there's absolutely no non-kosher animal, or even if there is a non-kosher animal, the Jew has to be in a place where they could see the non-Jew milk the cow. And the Ramah here adds, Raman, Hagan, Rav Moshe Isser lists his notes to the Shulchan Aruch. He adds, "Ulechatchila sarich liot Yisrael b'tchilat hachaliba." Lechatchila, before the fact, the Jew must be there, and the Jew must see the vessel that the non-Jew is going to milk the cow into, where the milk will go. You want to make sure that it's a clean vessel, that there's nothing kosher put in a vessel. And we have the accustomed to be strict to not use a vessel that a non-Jew normally uses to milk into. Lest there's some drops from non-kosher stuff in the bucket. But if you did it after the fact, it's okay. So the halakhah is pretty clear on this. A Jew is not allowed to have the milk of a non-Jew. The Jew either has to see the non-Jew milking it, or at least be nearby, know that there's absolutely no non-kosher animal in the flock, or be in a place where they could see theoretically what the non-Jew was doing. And the non-Jew has to know that a Jew is not allowed to have non-kosher animal milk. Great. Very, very clear what the halakhah is. It's a black and white. And yet, I'm assuming many people here know that in the US, we do have milk of a non-Jew. Many Orthodox, or many kosher Jews, I should say, do have milk milked by a non-Jew, and are not careful to only have milk produced by a Jew, or milk watched or milked by a Jew. So why is that? So there are two very important modern day, relatively modern. One is modern times, but halachic works about why we can have non-Jewish milk. So one is by the Pri Hadash, and he's writing in Amsterdam, I think 19th century, but modern, meaning not medieval, we're in modern time, Amsterdam. And he writes why they are allowed to have what's called Hadam Halav, non-Jewish produced milk. So the Pri Hadash writes, and this, at the end of this long piece that he writes, he concludes, Klal ha'olah. So a general rule which comes out of what he has said, De be'ir shalo nimsa sham chalav tameh. If you are in a place where there is no non-kosher animal milk, it's just not there. Oh, shehu yoter biyoker mechalav tahor, or the non-kosher animal milk costs more. Mutar liknot meha'akum chalab shechalvo, below Riyat Yisrael Kala. You are allowed to buy milk milked by a non-Jew, even though a Jew was not watching at all. So again, as long as it's a place where there's just no non-kosher milk at all, it's not available, so there's no chance that they're going to be having non-kosher milk, because they don't have it. So they wouldn't possibly mix it in because it's just not there. Or non-kosher milk costs more, so they're not going to add it into regular milk and then lose money. In all those cases, you don't have to buy a Jewish milk. And that's what the practice is. That's what the custom here is in Amsterdam. Gamkin zulat That's what I do. He writes that there are a few Jews who are very careful to only have milk, either milked by a Jew or watched by a Jew. But you don't need to, he says, and even he would buy this non-Jewish milk. But the Irshanim Shav Halav Tameh, but if there is a place where they do have non-kosher animal milk, even if the non-Jew whom you are buying from does not own a non-kosher animal in his flock, mikol makom sarich lerot akodem hachaliva bekli ulai hiniach sham halav tameh. You still have to check the vessel he's going to milk into to make sure there was no non-kosher animal milk placed in there before. The gam sarich lerot kol hachaliva mitchila v'ad, and you have to watch, the whole milking process being done. Or you can come and go. Or in a place where you could see if the non-Jew were to leave to get some other animal milk to mix in. So if you're in a place where there are non-kosher animal milk, or there is not kosher animal milk available, then you cannot rely on his leniency, and you would have to see the milking being done as the Shulchan Aruch said. But if it's a place where there is no non-kosher animal milk available, or non-kosher animal milk costs more, then you can buy non-Jewish milk. So that's the first very important leniency that we see with regard to Chalav Yisrael, and why Jews would have not only had a Jewish milk, and would have bought the milk of a non-Jew. And then, of course, there's the very famous Teshuvah by Reb Moshe Feinstein, on which observant Jews rely upon, who do not eat only a Jewish milk, Chalav Yisrael. And I only gave you the highlights of it. It's not very long, it's a little longer, but here are the highlights of it. And he writes, companies, the Medina Tenu, regarding the milk of companies in our state, in our country, asher yesh piakuach hamem shala, there's a government oversight. Ve'im yarvu chala behema tme'ah, if they were to add any other kind of milk to a cow's milk, they would be punished. They would receive a penalty. They would even close them down. The dairy industry is very regulated, says Rev Moshe, and therefore no company can mix in anything else other than the cow's milk that's being sold. Shalachein, therefore, vadai mitarti mila arev. They are definitely going to be afraid to add any other milk into the cow's milk. Yesh ta'am gadol lehatir. There is a very big reason to allow this. Af below shitat hapri hadash, even without the reasoning of the pri hadash that we saw before, meaning either it's in a place where there's only a kosher milk available, or the non-kosher milk is more expensive. Says Rev Moshe, in the U.S., you don't need those. Mishum de ha'ikar de yedi'ah birurahi. The fact how well we can know that no other milk will be mixed in is a clear proof. Keraya mamash. It's as if it's a literal proof. Deha keshvuot dafam dal gam edus dem mamon. It's like a testimony with regard to monetary matters. The adola mizeh itav atosfos daf in Yevamot. Now he goes to another concept called, he writes here, Anan Sahadeh, we test hefai, meaning when there's a thing which is so well known, it's so like obvious that everyone would know this, then it's as if we are witnesses to the matter. So this is an idea which Tosfos invokes in regard to a principle called Zachin Adam Shalo B'fa'anav. You are allowed to do good to a person without their knowledge because, says Tosfos, Anan Sahadeh, we are all witnesses to the fact that they would want it. So you can be a person present even without their knowledge, and they hone it because Anan Sahadeh, we are all witnesses that they would want it. And this is invoked with regard to why a child is allowed to convert, even though a child doesn't have the legal mind to be able to make transactions, but Anan Sahadeh, like we testify to that a person wants that which is good for them. So Anan Sahadeh, the fact that even if you don't see an actual thing happen, when you know it so well, that can work as an actual proof. That can work as an actual testimony. Edut, a testimony which is legally effective. So therefore, in the US, where we know legally a milk company is not allowed to add anything else other than the milk which they say is being sold. We know that's very heavily regulated. They would have severe penalties, fines, and punishments. That knowledge that they absolutely will not add any non-kosher milk works as a testimony that we have actually seen. So you don't actually have to see it and be witness to it happening to be able to use it as a testimony. The fact that we know that no other milk can be added is adequate. That knowledge is adequate for testimony, and that works as actual testimony. It's as if we've actually seen them milk the cows, and we can rely on that. And then the parts I together are all the different types of cases where we rely on this Anan Sahadeh. We can testify to the fact of when we really know or really sure of something, even if we don't actually see it happening. So the same thing with regard to the dairy industry in the US. And therefore, Rav Moshe concludes, Lachein bechalav she'asru, rak bechavo akum ve'ein Yisrael ro'aho. So in the case of milk, which normally would be prohibited where a Jew didn't watch it being milked, yesh lahatir, gam b'Yisrael yodin yedi'ah birura tahave kiri'ah. We can allow this milk even where you just know that no other non-kosher animal milk will be added. And we know that because the dairy industry is regulated by the government. And the fact that we know that, that's as if we watched it being milked and we watched that no other animal milk was mixed in. Anan Sahadeh, we can be witnesses from the fact that we know nothing else will be mixed in. And that knowledge works as if we saw the cows being milked. V'zeh she'im ye'arvu ye'anshu. And again, if they did milk, if they did add anything else, they would be punished. They'd have to close the company. They'd lose so much money. So the country, the government watches over them. That is definitely knowing. That is a clear knowledge that we can rely on. Shehi kiriyah. And that's as if we saw it happen. And therefore, the milk produced in the US would not fall under the prohibition of milk that was milked by a non-Jew. This is according to everybody. And you don't have to argue with this. You don't have to make this distinctions. Everyone could rely on this. And therefore, yesh lo ta'am gadol v'rashai. And one who wants to rely on this and drink the milk, which is no Jew involved at all, they can rely on this, and there's no problem at all. Kemo shemekilim bazeh harov b'nei adam shomrei Torah. Just like many people who observe Torah rely on this. V'gam harbe rabbanim, and there are also many rabbis who rely on this as well. V'chas v'shalom lomar she'osim shelo kedin, and God forbid to say that they're not keeping the halakhah. It is completely okay to have milk even where no Jew is involved in the U.S. Aval, but he does say mikol makom le'abale nefesh minaroi lehachmir. Someone who's very careful should be machmir, should be strict. There's no problem of being arrogant with this if you do want to be strict and only have milk produced by a Jew. I, says Rev Moshe, am machmir. I am strict for myself, and I only have milk produced by a Jew. But someone who wants to be lenient is within the halakhah. It's within the law. We don't have to consider this a person one who is lax with the prohibited things. So this is very important to teshuva, and of course this is a teshuva that people still rely on. Of course, there are also those who will say, well, see, he really didn't think one should be lenient. He only meant at that time when it was hard to get non-kosher produced milks. So, he does say it's good to be strict. He was strict in his help. And there are people today, obviously, who only have halav Yisrael, milk by a Jew, but he doesn't seem to limit this leniency to a time when it is hard to buy a kosher dairy products, and this is leniency which is still relied on by first, I think, the vast majority of kosher Jews. So in terms of why can we have milk of a non-Jew, so a few reasons we've seen. Either in the Mishnah and the Shulchan Aruch we've seen where a Jew watches the animal being milked, or in the pre-Hadash we saw in a place where there are no non-kosher animals, or I forgot to add, a non-kosher animal's milk costs more money, so no one's going to add that to kosher milk and then lie about it and then take a monetary loss. And finally, we saw Reb Moshe's very important teshuva, which is in the U.S., where the dairy industry is heavily regulated, and we know there are no other animal milk being added. It's completely fine to have milk produced by a non-Jew, and that is what many people rely on today as well. And so that is really a basis for a lot of American Jews practice in not only having a halav Yisrael, despite the very kind of a black and white isur that we saw written down in the Mishnah, the Gemara, Rambam, through the Rishonim and the Shulchan Aruch. Unlike Pat Akum and Bishul Akum, which we saw early on leniencies introduced, here this was one that was added fairly later on when dairy industries have become more regulated and centralized. Okay, so that is the first part, and I'm glad we'll have time to talk about cheese as well. If there's any questions, people are invited to ask. And if not, we will move on to a branch of this, or another aspect of this, which is cheese. Now, we already saw in the Gemara that a kosher milk, only a kosher milk curdles, whereas non-kosher milk does not. So that should already say the very fact that you're eating cheese would mean that it's a kosher animal's milk. So what would be the problem? Now, we did see there could be some non-kosher milk mixed in with the part of the kosher milk that does not curdle, or there may be some non-kosher milk that's hidden in the cracks of the curdled cheese. So we see there's a little room already to prohibit cheese, but it's also its own prohibition listed, described earlier on in the same chapter of this a tractate of Avodah Zarah. And it brings an anecdote in the Mishnah right before the Mishnah we have looked at. So in Parak Bet, again, chapter 2, Mishnah 5, the following is brought. Amar Rev Yehuda, Amar Shamuel. Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, Sha'al Rabbi Yishmael, it's Rabbi Yehoshua, Kishayu Machin Ba'aderech. Rabbi Ishmael asked Rabbi Yehoshua a question as they were walking along the road. And Amar Lo, he said to him, Mipnema Asru Givinot Shel Goyim. Why? What is the cause for the prohibition against the cheese of non-Jews? Amar Lo. So Rabbi Yehoshua said back to him, Mipnei Shema Amidim Ota Be'akeva Shel Ne'avela. Because they curdle their milk, meaning non-Jews curdle their milk inside the stomach of an avela, meaning a kosher animal, which was not properly slaughtered, halakhah, to make it kosher. So it's a concern that even if they're using kosher milk, they may curdle it with the rennet of an animal that wasn't properly slaughtered, and therefore the animal is not a kosher to eat. Okay, now, despite the fact that this Mishnah provides a reason for the prohibition, in the Bavli's discussion on it, a few more reasons are brought for why non-Jewish cheese, non-Jewish made cheese would be prohibited. So here's the English, and you can follow along in the Hebrew. So says the Gemara there, Mar Ula. Master Ula said, "V'i atima Rav Shmuel bar Abba." And if you want, you could say Shmuel bar Abba said. Okay, so they asked. Sorry, I'll skip it a little bit. My gezerata. What is the reason for the prohibition of eating cheese? And we're on the top of page 3 right now in the sources. So my gezerata. What is the reason for the decree prohibiting cheese of non-Jews? Amar Reb Shimon ben Apazi, Amar Reb Yeshua ben Levi. So Reb Shimon ben Apazi said in the name of Reb Yeshua ben Levi, he said, Mishum Nikor. The concern is due to puncturing. Puncturing means they would leave their milk exposed, and there was a fear that a snake might have deposited some of its venom into it. So apparently, Rashi explains, non-Jews weren't careful about covering their liquids the way Jews were. And this is also why in the Gemara, you're not allowed to have water that was left out open overnight either. Now, Tosfos is going to explain, just like we don't hold like that anymore, this also shouldn't apply anymore. But anyway, so says Rabbi Shua ben Levi, the fear is that the non-Jew might have left the milk exposed, and then a snake will come and deposit its venom into it. And you don't want to have that. That would kill you. So that's the first answer I've given, because they might expose the milk. They might leave it uncovered overnight. Rabbi Hanina, the next answer I've given, Lefi she'efshar la below sachsuchei halav, because it's impossible if a non-Jew is making this milk into cheese, then there's got to be some non-kosher droplets left in it, because they're making it in their own vessels, and they have non-kosher milk also. So we're concerned that some of their non-kosher milk will be left in the vessel in which they're making the cheese. That's the answer number 2. Answer number 3, Shmuel Amar, Shmuel says, This is the answer we saw brought down in the Mishnah, that they curdle their cheese in the skin of the stomach of non-kosher slaughtered, of non-slaughtered animals. They use the rennet of animals which weren't properly slaughtered. That's the third answer given. Answer number 4, Rev Machia Mishmid Rev Ada bar Ahava Amar. So Rev Machia says in the name of Rev Ada bar Ahava, Mipnei shemachlikim paneha v'shuman hazir. This is really a severe answer, because they smear the surface of their cheese with pig fat. So that makes it totally not kosher. Rev Chisda Amar, Mipnei shemamidim ota bechometz. They curdle it with vinegar. And Rev Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar, Mipnei shemamidim ota besharaf ha'ala. The last answer given by Rev Nachman bar Yitzchak is that they curdle it with the sap of a plant which is arla, meaning which they haven't waited for the 4th year to get a benefit from it. So most of these answers, numbers 2 through 6, is the fear that there's something not allowed for a Jew mixed in with it in some way. But the first answer brought by Rabbi Shua ben Levi is this fear, which is a fear expressed during the Talmudic times, is that the milk might have been exposed, left out overnight, and then a snake would come and contaminate it. Now, the reason it's important to know which reason is the reason for not allowing cheese is because depending on what the reasons are, that will determine whether this would apply today or not. So, for example, in the next source you have, the Tosfot looks at the different reasons and sees, well, this should be okay nowadays. So the first Tosfos you have, first he says the very fact that it curdles should show that this is obviously the milk of a kosher animal. So that's what Tosfos writes in the first one I brought for you here. He says, if you're buying it for cheese, obviously this milk can curdle, and obviously it's the milk of a kosher animal. But the next Tosfos one I want to look at more, and he says, so which of these reasons is the reason for not allowing cheese? So Tosfos says it's the first one, ni'akor. Omer Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Meir said, Ki achshav lo matzinu tam pashut le'isor begibinat oved kochavim. There's no real reason to prohibit the cheese made by a non-Jew. Why? Because the reason why cheese was prohibited in the first place was this fear of it being punctured by a snake, and that's the reason. Because we always hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and then he says the lekka. And nowadays, that's not a fear anymore. We don't worry about food being exposed, and this fear that a snake is going to come, because he explains this. I'm in the second line, the second Tosfos. But anu she'ein nechashim mitzuyim beinenu ein lachosh mishum agiloi. There are no snakes around, so we don't have to worry about this. It's not relevant to us. Now, maybe you'll say, well, just because the reason no longer applies, the halakhah should still apply. That's what we always say. Just because they don't sell rice with grains anymore, I don't now eat rice on Pesach. Kitniot still applies, even if the reason no longer applies. So just because snakes no longer are around, shouldn't the prohibition still apply? Tosfos says, no, that is wrong. Because he says, this whole halakhah, this whole prohibition was only made in a place where snakes are found. And so even back then, if there were no snakes around, there would be no prohibition. So we don't have snakes around, so this isn't relevant. And even back then, when the original prohibition was made, it was only made in a place where there is a fear that a snake will come and puncture their milk, their exposed food. So this is not a case where just because the reason no longer applies, the halakhah should still apply. Because even when this original prohibition was made, it was only made in a place where this was a fear, this was a concern. And this is like what we saw Rabbeinu Tam say by bread as well. It was only, that this whole prohibition was only in places where people, prohibited the bread made by a non-Jew. So that's the first thing he says. If the reason is nikor, that there's a fear of snakes, well, that doesn't apply where there's no snakes, and we don't have those nowadays. Now, maybe you'll say, well, there's another reason. Or they would curdle with the remnant of a non-properly slaughtered animal. So Tosfos says that's also not a problem, because he says that Gam ge'onei ner abona hitiru otam b'makomam mitam shmamidim otam b'pirachim. So the rabbis of Ner Abona allowed non-Jewish cheese where it was curdled with a plant origin rennet. So we already see that there are rabbis who allow cheese made by non-Jews, as long as animal rennet wasn't used. So either the reason is snakes, that doesn't apply, that's not a problem. And if the reason is they might use the rennet of a non-slaughtered animal, well, if you know that that's not the case, if it's a vegan rennet, then that would be fine. And we see rabbis have allowed that in the past. And Tosfos concludes, but where they live, they did use animal rennet, so they didn't allow cheese of non-Jews. But as long as these two factors are met, Rabbeinu Tam would allow the cheese of a non-Jew. However, in this regard, Rabbeinu Tam, the Tosfos are minorities, because everyone else, all of the other medieval Rishonim, did not allow cheese made by a non-Jew. So the Rashba responds, Rav Shlomo ben Aderet responds to Rabbeinu Tam and basically says, even if none of these are a concern, even if there's no snakes around, even if they're using a vegan rennet, there's no animal, there's no pig being smeared on it, non-kosher, non-Jewish made cheese is not a kosher, because he explains, unlike Tosfos who says this original prohibition only applied in places where snake puncturing is a concern, Rashba disagrees, and he writes, Kol shene asar b'minyan, as long whatever was established by a beit din of rabbis, afilu batel hata'am, even if the reason no longer applies, lo batel davar, the prohibition has not been annulled. So even though none of these original reasons for the prohibition may still be relevant, says the Rashba, this prohibition still applies. And that is the view of the Rambam as well, although he goes a little bit a different direction. He says that the Geonim, in the next source, he says, really maybe cheese made by a non-Jew, if they're not using animal rennet, should be okay. However, he writes, Givina, he says in Yud Adalit 14, you have the English as well, Horu miksat hageonim, shehi asura, the Geonim rule that it is still prohibited, shekvar gazru al kol givinot ha'akum, because all cheese made by non-Jews was made prohibited. Ben shemidu b'davar asur, ben shemidu b'davar mutar. Irrespective of what they used to curdle it with, whether it's an animal-based rennet, whether it's a vegan rennet. It was a prohibition was made. Why do we always prohibit non-Jewish made cheese? Because there's a fear if we allow you to use a plant-based rennet, you might come to use an animal-based rennet. So that is the view of really the vast majority of the Rishonim and out the Shulchan Aruch holds as well. And he codifies the halakhah, and I'll just read my summaries here because we're pressed for time. Cheese of a non-Jew is always prohibited, even if none of these concerns apply. So either, like the Rashba said, because once a prohibition is made, even if the reason no longer applies, the prohibition will still apply. Or as the Rambam said, well, if we allow to use a vegan rennet, you might come to mistakenly think that you can also have a cheese where it's an animal-based rennet used to curdle that cheese. So that is how the halakhah is codified. Now, again, the Rama adds that if a non-Jew watches the cheese being made, that would be fine, and that would allow the cheese to be consumed by a Jew. The Shach, however, says, no, it's not enough for a Jew to watch. A Jew has to actively be a part of the cheese making process. Now, in the 3 minutes I have left, I now just want to explore one other question on this. So this was all about a cheese which is made through rennet. That's curdled through a rennet. Not that I know anything about making a cheese, but I looked online and saw that there are, in fact, 2 ways to make a cheese. One is to put a rennet into curdle it, and again, that could be an animal-based one or a vegan one, but that prohibition would always apply. But there's another way to make cheese where you add an acid and then it lowers the pH level. Those of you who understand what I'm talking about, great. Those of you who don't, so something like a cottage cheese does not involve any animal product at all. It would involve adding acid. So there'd be no fear of an animal being used and a non-kosher animal being used in the process of making a cheese. So the question is, what if the cheese uses acid and not rennet? Is it still prohibited? So there are 2 views on it. The view of the Aruch Shulchan, and again, we'll see the view of Reb Moshe. My PowerPoint by this last class has gotten very sophisticated. I learned how to use this graph. So the Aruch Shulchan, which you have, says as follows. Why is cheese made by a non-Jew prohibited? Because animal rennet is used and the animal might be non-kosher. And what's the reason? And then, since even where vegan rennet is used is not, even where a vegan rennet is used, it's still not kosher, even though there's clearly no fear that anything non-kosher was mixed in. So if we prohibit a vegan rennet, then we should also prohibit when acid is used. That same logic, which says a vegan rennet still makes cheese not kosher, would also say that even if no rennet is used at all, it's just an acid which is added to the milk, that should also be not kosher. And that's the view of the Aruch HaShulchan. So for him, even something like a cottage cheese would be non-kosher if it was made by a non-Jew. And that's what he writes. Even our cheese, which has no curdling at all, the prohibition is still in its place. Reb Moshe disagrees and says, well, cheese is prohibited because animal rennet is used. Now, why is a vegan rennet cheese prohibited for the Rambam? Because there's a fear that if we allow to use a plant-based rennet, then you might come to use an animal-based rennet. But says Rev Moshe, if no rennet is used, then there's no reason to make the decree, because no one will come to use animal rennet where acid is used. That is 2 steps removed from the original prohibition. So we'll only prohibit 1 step from the prohibition. If we allow to use a plant rennet, you might come to use animal rennet, fine. But acid is so far removed that no one would come to mistakenly use animal rennet. And therefore, Rev Moshe says, Lo shaykh behu hagezera, mishum hamamidin bedavar ha'asor shehu inyan gevina acheret. There's no concern about curdling because it's a whole other type of cheese. So he was lenient again about a cottage cheese as well, though he did end off by saying that he didn't want to make like a general policy to be lenient about this and say you can have non-Jewish made cottage cheese, but he did say that me'ikar hadin, by the letter of the law, it is technically okay, and that is why there are people who make a distinction between a cottage cheese on the one hand and other types of cheese on the other. So to take this last minute to review what we've done, we have seen, according to the Mishnah, it is prohibited to have the milk by a non-Jew, and this was the halakhah for most of time. More recently, various leniencies were introduced, and culminating with Rev Moshe, who said in the U.S., where the dairy industry is heavily regulated, we know there's no other animal being added, it is completely fine to have non-Jewish milked milk. And cheese, however, although there was a view of Rabbeinu Tam who wanted to allow a cheese made by a non-Jew based on the fact that the reasons for the original prohibition no longer applied, no one else agrees with that. And either we go with the Rashba who says, well, just because the reason no longer applies, the prohibition still applies, or the Rambam's reason is, well, if we allow you to use a vegan rennet, you might come to use an animal rennet, which might be not kosher. Whatever the reason is, non-Jewish made cheese is still a prohibition according to the halakhah as codified by the Shulchan Aruch and most poskim as well. Now, whether this applies to a cottage cheese, that is a dispute amongst the modern day post again with the Aruch Shulchan stating that it's no different than a vegan-based rennet, which we also prohibit, even though it's technically kosher. Versus Rev Moshe says, well, that is so far removed from the original prohibition, there is nothing technically wrong with a cottage cheese made by a non-Jew, but he didn't want to kind of make that a policy rule and still urge people to buy Jewish-made cottage cheese. And there's so much written about this, so I urge everybody to continue learning about the controversy of cheese, why there are people who eat out, and where that would all come from. So thank you so much. I apologize for going a few minutes over time, but I just wanted to get this all in, and it's been a pleasure to learn with you all. And anyone who has a question is welcome to write. And thank you so much for this opportunity to learn together, and have a wonderful day on the East Coast, night in Israel, and everything in between. Thank you.